The night was silent, save for the echo of engines rolling through the narrow waters of the Fjord. It was just after 4 a.m., April 9th, 1940, a cold Tuesday morning. From the south, a dark shape moved steadily through the mist. The German heavy cruiser Blücher, pride of the Kriegsmarine, led a column of warships northward, its bow slicing through the black water. On board, more than 2,000 men, sailors, soldiers, and bureaucrats believed they were about to seize Oslo and secure Norway before dawn. But on the small island of Oscarsborg, hidden in the fjord's narrow throat, an aging Norwegian fortress stood in their path. Its commander, Colonel Birger Eriksen, had been awake since midnight. His orders from Oslo were vague. The government, uncertain of Germany's intentions, had not declared war. But as Eriksen watched the distant glow of searchlights reflecting off the fog, he made his choice. He turned to his men, conscripts most barely trained, and spoke calmly. "Either I will be decorated, or I will be court-martialed. Fire." Moments later, the thunder of 11-inch Krupp guns shattered the night. The shells screamed across the fjord, their trails vanishing into darkness. Then, impact. The Blücher lurched violently as fire erupted from her deck. Within minutes, chaos consumed the German flagship. It was the first clash of the German invasion of Norway, and one of the most improbable victories of the entire war. Ancient guns and forgotten torpedoes, relics from the last century, had just stopped one of Hitler's most modern warships dead in the water. The fjord itself became a graveyard, and the decision made by one aging officer in the fog would change the fate of a nation. Europe was burning. By the spring of 1940, Adolf Hitler's armies stood poised to dominate the continent. Poland had fallen. Denmark would soon surrender without a fight. And now, the Führer's gaze turned north, to Norway, a country of mountains, fjords, and vital sea lanes. To Hitler, Norway was not just another conquest. It was a lifeline. German industry ran on Swedish iron ore that passed through the Norwegian port of Narvik each winter when the Baltic froze. If Britain controlled Norway's coast, Germany's war machine could be strangled in months. The plan was named Operation Weserübung, the Weser exercise. Under it, German forces would simultaneously seize 6 key Norwegian cities: Oslo, Kristiansand, Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. The strategy relied on speed, surprise, and shock. At its core was Task Force 5, commanded by Admiral Oskar Kummetz. His mission: capture Oslo intact, occupy the capital before dawn, and secure the Norwegian king and government before they could flee. The flagship of his fleet was the brand new heavy cruiser Blücher, sleek, fast, and bristling with guns. But there was a flaw in the plan, one born not of arrogance, but of ignorance. German intelligence had studied old maps and outdated reports that described Norway's coastal fortresses as relics, obsolete and unstaffed. They believed Oslo's defences would crumble at the first show of force. They were wrong. Far from Berlin's planning rooms, the fjords told a different story. The narrow waterways were treacherous, walled by cliffs, threaded with fog, and filled with unseen dangers. And guarding the entrance to the capital like a forgotten giant stood Oscarsborg Fortress, its guns old, but its heart unbroken. On the evening of April 8th, as Blücher and her escorts approached the southern tip of Norway, a small Norwegian patrol vessel, Pole 3, spotted them. Its commander, Captain Leif Welding Olsen, radioed Oslo to report unknown warships entering Norwegian waters. Before he could get a reply, tracer fire split the night. The Pole 3 burned and sank, and Welding Olsen, refusing to abandon his post, became the first Norwegian to die in the invasion of his homeland. By midnight, the Germans pressed on, undeterred. Their fleet steamed into the fjord, past lighthouses dim for blackout, past fishing villages that slept unaware of the armada sliding silently by. Above them, at Oscarsborg, Colonel Eriksson stood on the ramparts listening to the low thunder rolling through the mist. He didn't know what was coming, only that something vast and foreign was moving toward the capital. And as the first glimmer of dawn touched the water, the sound of engines grew louder. The iron road north was open, but ahead lay a fortress, and a decision that would stop an empire in its tracks. Through the night, the German armada cut silently through the fjord, a procession of dark silhouettes gliding past sleeping villages. The lead ship, Blucher, moved confidently, her bow waves shimmering under the moonlight. She was the pride of the Kriegsmarine, barely 6 months in service, her decks gleaming and her crew restless with expectation. Behind her followed a convoy of warships and transports, the light cruiser Emden, the escort ship Lutzow, and smaller vessels packed with infantry, Gestapo officers and political envoys. Among them were bureaucrats destined to form the new Reichskommissariat of Norway once Oslo fell. The men aboard Blucher believed they were heading to a near bloodless victory. Their orders were clear: seize the capital, arrest King Haakon VII, and secure the government before dawn. Few expected resistance. At Admiral Oskar Kummetz's table, maps lay spread beneath the dull red glow of a lamp. His officers traced the fjord's narrow path northward, whispering quietly over coffee and cigarette smoke. The admiral was calm, assured. Berlin's intelligence had declared Oslofjord's defences obsolete, its guns rusted, its soldiers few. The mission was to be more a ceremony than a battle, but in the stillness, the fjord hid its secrets. As the flotilla advanced, faint signals flickered along the shore, Norwegian lookouts awakening to the thunder of engines. Messages began to move through the darkness, reports of unidentified ships, too large for fishing vessels, too organized for merchants. Further north, at Oscarsborg Fortress, those messages reached Colonel Birger Eriksson. His men had been on alert since midnight, their searchlights sweeping through the mist, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. The fortress had not fired its guns in decades. Many of its soldiers were conscripts barely trained to load them. Down below, buried into the island's rock, an ancient torpedo battery slept in darkness, manned by a skeleton crew of reservists who had never fired a live shot. They oiled mechanisms built before they were born, checking gauges that had not moved in years. Outside, the water was calm. A mist hung low over the channel. The engines drew nearer. At 4 a.m., Blucher entered Drobak Sound, her searchlights cutting through the fog. On her decks, sailors stood ready for the salute they expected from the Norwegian fort ahead. A formality, nothing more. But the fortress remained silent. No lights, no signal. Only the sound of gulls and the slow churn of steel in water. Inside the command post, Colonel Eriksson studied the silhouette emerging through the haze. He asked for identification. None came. He gave one final order. "Ready all guns!" The batteries creaked as they swung toward the approaching ship. In the fog-drenched stillness of the fjord, the war was about to begin. And no one on Blucher knew it yet. At the narrowest point of the Oslofjord stood an island of rock and pine, Oscarsborg Fortress. Built in the 1890s, it had once been Norway's pride, its cannons guarding the approach to Oslo. But by 1940, it was a relic. The guns were older than most of the men assigned to them, and the fortress was staffed not by veterans, but by reservists and raw conscripts. Yet beneath the stone walls, buried deep in the bedrock, something ancient and forgotten still waited. When Colonel Birger Eriksson took command of Oscarsborg, he had inherited not just rusting artillery, but a duty to protect the capital, no matter how outdated his tools. Now, in the pale mist of that April morning, He stood at the heart of a defense no one in Berlin even knew existed. His men were nervous. Some had never fired a live round. The fog was so thick they could barely see the water below. But through the haze came the unmistakable growl of diesel engines, a sound that didn't belong in peaceful Norway. In the gun battery known as Kopors, crewmen loaded two massive Krupp 11-inch guns, each shell weighing nearly 300 kilograms. These weapons had been installed in 1893 and hadn't seen action since. Down below, at the torpedo battery, the last functioning underwater weapon system in Norway was being prepared. Its operators, most of them in their 50s, checked the valves and air compressors on torpedoes built before the First World War. Whitehead models, primitive but deadly. The men worked quietly, following rituals remembered from older officers. They didn't know if the weapons would even fire. No one had tried in decades. At 4:15 a.m., spotters at the southern post caught movement through the mist. Dark hulls, a column of ships heading north. The first was enormous. Colonel Eriksson hesitated only a moment. His standing orders required confirmation from the capital before opening fire. But Oslo wasn't answering. He turned to his artillery officer, Captain Andreas Andersen, and gave the command that would become legend. Fire with the main battery. Aim for the leading ship. The crew held their breath. The old fort trembled as the first gun roared. The fortress had come alive. From deep in the tunnels, the torpedo men listened as echoes of the guns rolled through the rock. They readied their levers. Above them, Eriksson watched as a fireball briefly lit the mist. The German cruiser Blücher had been struck. He ordered a second round. Another explosion tore across the fjord. The fortress in the fog, dismissed as obsolete, had just awakened and changed the course of the war in Norway. The first shell struck Blücher near her forward superstructure, tearing through her side and igniting stores of fuel and ammunition. Men on deck were hurled into the air as burning oil splashed across the steel. The ship shuddered violently, slowing as smoke billowed from her midsection. Inside the bridge, alarms screamed. Admiral Oskar Kummitz, stunned by the sudden attack, ordered full speed ahead and demanded identification of the attacker. But there was no time. The fog had swallowed the shore, and the flashes of gunfire were the only answer. A second 11-inch shell hit moments later. It smashed into the aircraft hangar, detonating fuel for Blücher's reconnaissance plane. Flames raced across the decks. Ammunition stores began to cook off. The cruiser's internal lighting failed. Men stumbled through corridors lit only by the orange glare of fire. On the hill above, Colonel Birger Eriksson gave his next order calmly. Prepare the torpedo battery. In the darkness below the fortress, the old crewmen opened the steel doors of their launch tunnels. Cold seawater rushed in. They set the depth to 3 meters, just below Blücher's armoured belt, and waited. At 4:34 a.m. the command was given. Fire torpedo 1. A low hiss, then silence, followed by a dull explosion as the weapon hit home. Seconds later, fire torpedo 2. The second torpedo struck amidships. The blasts tore open Blücher's port side, flooding engine rooms and knocking out her steering. Power flickered, then died. She began to list heavily. Above decks, chaos reigned. Officers shouted orders no one could hear. Ammunition magazines exploded one by one. Smoke and steam enveloped the bridge. Men leapt into the freezing fjord, their uniforms aflame. The oil slicks burning on the surface turned the water itself into fire. In the command tower, Admiral Kummitz realized the truth. His flagship was lost. He signaled the ships behind to halt and reverse course. But the narrow fjord made maneuvering impossible. The entire invasion column jammed together, trapped in confusion. By 5 a.m., Blücher was drifting, her bow sinking. The proud cruiser, Hitler's spearhead to capture Oslo, had been gutted by guns and torpedoes built before the First World War. From the fortress, Eriksson watched the burning ship through breaks in the fog. He could hear faint explosions echoing across the water. Then, at 7:30, a massive detonation split the air as the cruiser's magazine exploded. The blast rolled down the fjord like thunder, shattering windows miles away. When the smoke cleared, Blucher was gone. She had taken with her more than 800 men, sailors, soldiers and officials meant to govern Norway under German rule. The survivors clung to debris or swam toward shore, only to face the icy grip of the fjord. For the Norwegians, the unimaginable had happened. An obsolete fortress manned by conscripts and reservists had destroyed one of Germany's newest and most powerful warships, and in doing so, they had bought something beyond measure: time. Because of Blucher's destruction, the German invasion schedule collapsed. Troops meant to seize Oslo were stranded. The royal family and government, alerted by the explosions, began their flight north. As the flames faded on the fjord, the echoes of that morning would soon reach every capital in Europe, and Hitler's perfect plan had just unravelled because one Norwegian officer refused to wait for orders. As the fires of Blucher burned through the morning, their glow was visible for miles down the fjord. The thunder of the explosions rolled north toward Oslo, a distant warning carried on cold air. In the capital, telephones rang, radios crackled, and the truth dawned. Germany had invaded Norway. At the royal palace, King Haakon VII and his ministers gathered in haste. They had expected negotiations, not bombs. Only hours earlier, the German envoy in Oslo had delivered a message promising friendship. Now the sound of battle echoed from the sea. The king was 70 years old, dignified but resolute. When his advisers urged surrender, he refused. "Norway cannot yield to force," he said quietly. "We will not hand our country to Hitler." Thanks to Blucher's destruction, the German troops meant to seize the palace and arrest the government were stranded. The invasion schedule was in ruins. Admiral Oscar Kummetz's surviving ships dared not advance through Drobak Sound again, fearing the same invisible guns and torpedoes. For a few precious hours, Norway had a chance. The government ordered an evacuation. Trains were prepared, documents packed, royal regalia sealed into crates. The most valuable cargo of all, the Norwegian crown and the king himself, departed the city just after noon. As they left Oslo, German aircraft appeared overhead, circling like vultures. Bombs fell on the outskirts of the city, but the royal convoy pressed northward along snow-covered roads. Each hour gained was bought with blood and fire at Oscarsborg. Behind them, German forces finally landed at Moss, south of Oslo, and began their advance toward the capital. But they were too late. By the time they entered the city that evening, the king and government were gone, carrying Norway's sovereignty with them. For the Norwegians who remained, the sight of Blucher's burning wreck drifting beneath the cliffs became a symbol, proof that the invaders could bleed. For Hitler, it was an embarrassment. His lightning conquest of Norway, planned to be swift and bloodless, had been slowed by one fortress and one man who refused to wait for orders. Colonel Birger Eriksson and his garrison stood ready for the next assault. They expected annihilation. Instead, they received radio silence. The Germans hesitated, unsure how many more guns or torpedoes waited in the mist. By the time they finally reached Oscarsborg and took the surrender of its exhausted defenders, the king was gone, the government in exile, and Norway's resistance alive. That single act of defiance in the early morning hours of April 9th had bought the kingdom its freedom in spirit, if not in territory. And in a war ruled by technology, blitzkrieg and terror, it was an ancient fortress, and the courage of a handful of men that had rewritten the first chapter of Norway's fight for survival. The wreck of the Blücher still lies beneath the cold waters of Drøbak Sound, silent, rusting, and shrouded in silt. For decades its twisted steel has rested where it fell, a monument to the morning when an empire met its match. In the days following the sinking, word spread quickly across occupied Europe. The Germans had seized Norway, but not without humiliation. Blücher's loss delayed the capture of Oslo and allowed Norway's leadership to escape, ensuring that the Norwegian flag would fly again in exile, beside those of Britain and the Free French. In Berlin, Hitler was furious. His admirals blamed outdated charts and fog. His intelligence officers blamed the weather. But deep down, everyone understood what had happened. Germany's most modern warship had been destroyed by 19th-century guns and torpedoes built before the First World War. Weapons the invaders had dismissed as scrap. At Oscarsborg Fortress, the defenders waited for the inevitable counterattack. When the German troops finally arrived, they found the garrison exhausted but unbroken. Colonel Birger Eriksen surrendered only after confirming that his men had accomplished their duty. Even the German officers who accepted his surrender reportedly saluted him, a gesture of respect for a man who had defied impossible odds. For Norway, Eriksen became a national hero. His calm defiance, his decision to act without orders, embodied the spirit of resistance that would carry the country through 5 long years of occupation. In the decades that followed, the story of the Blücher and Oscarsborg was told and retold, not just as a tale of battle, but as a reminder of resolve. The wreck remained on the fjord's floor, leaking oil, occasionally disturbed by divers or salvage teams. Eventually it was declared a protected war grave. Each year on April 9th, Norwegians paused to remember the day their fortress woke from its long sleep and brought their nation its dignity. Standing on the ramparts today, it's easy to imagine that morning, the faint hum of engines, the silence before the first thunder of the guns. The fjord looks peaceful now, calm, reflective, serene. But beneath its surface lies the memory of fire and steel, of courage and fear, of decisions made in seconds that changed a nation's fate. History often celebrates the weapons of power, the great machines, the endless arsenals. But sometimes history turns not on power but on resolve, on a handful of men, an old fortress, and the conviction that surrender is not the only choice. That morning in 1940, the echoes of the fjord carried across Norway and into history, a reminder that even in the age of modern war, the heart of resistance still beats in the courage of ordinary men. The sea was quiet, a mirror of grey beneath the morning mist. Then a flash tore through it. The thunder of a gun rolled across the waves. On one side, a merchant ship, its name painted in plain black letters, Stephen Hopkins. On the other, a predator, disguised, armoured, waiting. The German raider Steyr had come to hunt. Within moments, the calm was gone. Steel screamed, the deck shook, smoke poured from the wounded hull. Behind the 4-inch gun at the stern, an 18-year-old cadet named Edwin Joseph O'Hara loaded shell after shell. His commander, Lieutenant Kenneth Willett, was already down, torn by shrapnel, bleeding on the deck. Around O'Hara, his crewmates lay scattered. The order to abandon ship had been given. But he stayed. 5 shells left. 5 heartbeats of defiance. As each round slammed into the German raider, the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. Minutes later, the Hopkins was sinking, but so was her enemy. This was not a battleship, nor a destroyer, nor a vessel meant for war. She was a liberty ship, a freighter built to carry cargo, not to fight. Yet on that September morning in 1942, she fought until her heart broke. And when the ocean closed over her decks, it carried with it 42 souls. including her captain, Paul Buck, who had refused to surrender. 19 men escaped in a lifeboat. A month later, only 15 would touch land again. This is their story of steel, salt, and courage in the quiet heart of the Atlantic. By 1942, the Allied war effort was drowning in its own need. Men could be trained, weapons forged, but without transport, without cargo ships, no army could move, no soldier could eat, no tank could reach the front. Out of that desperation came a new kind of vessel, plain, square, and built in a hurry. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called them his ugly ducklings. The world would know them as Liberty ships. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 2,700 of these ships would roll down American slipways, each one longer than a football field, each able to carry 10,000 tons of cargo. Together they formed a lifeline that fed armies, rebuilt fleets, and carried a war across 2 oceans. They were built fast, faster than anyone had believed possible. The first took 8 months to complete. Within a year, Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards in California and Oregon could launch one in 30 days. The record, 4 days and 15 hours. Welding replaced riveting. Prefabricated sections were built like pieces of a puzzle. Deckhouses, bulkheads, engines, assembled by thousands of hands that had never seen a ship before. Rosie the riveters and Wendy the welders, men and women, white and black, worked side by side, 24 hours a day under floodlights that turned the night into steel-coloured noon. They built these ships not for glory, but for need. Every Liberty ship was a floating promise to deliver, to endure, to return. Among them was one named SS Stephen Hopkins, hull number 240, launched from Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard number 2 on April 14th, 1942. Her namesake was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a man who once wrote that, "Without liberty, life is a misery." The ship bearing his name would prove him right. Commanded by Captain Paul Buck, a 40-year-old New Englander with 2 decades at sea, the Hopkins carried a mixed crew. Merchant Marine officers, Navy gunners and cadets from the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. They came from everywhere, from San Francisco and Kentucky, from Massachusetts and California, from farms, factories and waterfront towns. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger. On September 10th, 1942, she left Cape Town, her holds nearly empty, bound for Dutch Guiana. The South Atlantic was quiet then, too quiet. U-boats prowled below and German raiders roamed the surface disguised as harmless freighters. Among them was the Steer, a 434-foot auxiliary cruiser armed with 6 5.9-inch guns, torpedoes, and machine cannons. The Hopkins, by contrast, had a single 4-inch gun mounted aft, 2 small anti-aircraft cannons, and a handful of machine guns. Her strength lay not in her firepower but in the stubbornness of those aboard her. As the ship steamed northwest through fog and grey swells, no one aboard could know they were about to face one of the most improbable battles in maritime history. A duel between a freighter and a warship, between endurance and annihilation. Dawn broke slowly on September 27th, 1942. The Stephen Hopkins had been at sea for more than 2 weeks. The air was damp and heavy, the sky layered with fog. In the wheelhouse, Captain Paul Buck studied his charts while the ship's cadets kept watch. Around 9:30 that morning, the mist ahead of the bow began to thin, and a shape appeared on the horizon. At first it seemed another merchant vessel, about the same size as the Hopkins. No flags, no markings, moving slow and steady. Then, faintly through the haze, the crew noticed something strange. Panels on her decks shifting, as if sliding open. Beneath them, the long, dark barrels of naval guns. The other ship was no merchantman. She was the German raider Stier, outwardly a cargo ship, inwardly a war machine. Built in Hamburg, armed with 6 5.9-inch guns, torpedo tubes and anti-aircraft cannons, she carried more than 300 trained naval men under Captain Horst Gerlach. Beside her loomed another silhouette, the Tannenfels, a supply ship laden with ammunition and fuel. The raider had been taking on provisions when fate brought the Hopkins out of the fog. The distance between them was scarcely 2 miles. A signal flashed across the water, a demand for the American vessel to stop, surrender and prepare to be boarded. Captain Buck looked through his binoculars. He could see the false deck panels sliding back, the enemy crew running to battle stations. He didn't hesitate. "Tell the engine room, full ahead," he said. Below deck, the engineers obeyed without question. Then Buck turned to his gunnery officer, Lieutenant Kenneth Willett, a 26-year-old naval reservist commanding the armed guard detachment. "If they want a fight," Buck said quietly, "we'll give them one." Within seconds, the Steyr opened fire. Her first shells screamed overhead, crashing into the sea short of their mark. The next found the Hopkins superstructure. Shrapnel tore through the bridge, killing one of the helmsmen instantly. Buck gave his order, "Battle stations." The engine room roared. The ship's only heavy weapon, the 4-inch gun mounted on her stern, was manned by Willett and a handful of seamen. The first shells were loaded, their brass casings gleaming in the sun that was finally breaking through the fog. The Hopkins returned fire. The deck shuddered as the first round left the barrel, 33 pounds of steel and explosive racing across the sea. It struck low on the Steyr's hull near her rudder. Smoke burst from the impact. The gun crew cheered. A direct hit, but the German ship answered with a salvo that ripped through the Hopkins engine room. Steam and oil erupted upward. Several men were killed instantly. The ship lost power and began to slow. On the Steyr, Captain Gerlach must have believed victory was certain. His cruiser outweighed and outgunned the freighter 10-1, yet the Hopkins refused to stop firing. Willett, wounded by shrapnel in the abdomen, stayed at his post directing the gun. Around him, loaders worked in smoke so thick they could barely breathe. On the bridge, Captain Buck tried to keep the ship's stern pointed toward the enemy so that the gunners could continue to fire, even as the hull below them burned. Down in the forward gun tub, cadets manned their smaller anti-aircraft cannons, firing at the Tannenfels to keep her from closing in. Shells tore through the masts and lifeboats, and the air filled with the metallic shriek of ricochets. One shell smashed into the Hopkins radio room. Hudson Huey, the radio officer, managed to send a single transmission before being killed at his post. The signal reached no one, but it stood as proof that the Hopkins fought to the last. The battle had now lasted nearly 20 minutes. Both ships were taking damage. The Hopkins deck was slick with oil and blood. Smoke curled from every hatch. Still her gun thundered, but the pace was slowing. One by one the gunners fell. The loaders were gone. Lieutenant Willett collapsed, too weak to stand. The gun fell silent. Smoke and steam drifted across the deck. Amid the wreckage, a young cadet began to move, his figure lost in the haze. The Atlantic thundered with gunfire. The Stephen Hopkins and the Steyr were barely 2 miles apart now, each throwing steel into the other's hull. The air between them shimmered with cordite smoke and salt spray. The Hopkins' stern gun pounded on. The deck crew shouted above the roar, feeding shells into the breach as fast as their blistered hands could manage. One shell every 45 seconds, slow by naval standards, but every shot struck with purpose. The first hit had torn into the Steyr's steering gear. Another smashed her forward gun. Even through the haze, flashes of orange showed where fires were taking hold along the German ship's deck. But the return fire was merciless. A heavy shell tore through the American freighter's midsection, ripping open the engine room. Steam burst upward as pipes exploded. The men below, firemen, oilers and engineers, were scalded where they stood. On the bridge, Captain Buck steadied himself against the shock. "Keep her stern to them," he ordered. "As long as that gun can fire, we fight." Down at the 4-inch gun, Lieutenant Willett's uniform was slick with blood from a wound in his abdomen. Still, he directed the remaining crew, shouting target corrections through the smoke. When he collapsed, the loaders kept firing until another blast hurled them to the deck. When the haze lifted, he was at the gun. Cadet Midshipman Edwin Joseph O'Hara, 18 years old, an engine cadet from California. Around him lay the men who had taught him to fight. 5 shells remained. He dragged the first round into place, swung the barrel toward the German raider, and fired. The blast threw him backward inky. But he stood again, deafened and shaking, and loaded another. The second shell struck the Steyr near the waterline. The third set off an explosion amidships. The fourth hit just below her bridge, spraying debris across the sea. The fifth and final shell left the barrel glowing red. Moments later, a blast on the Steyr's deck signaled a magazine fire. When the smoke cleared, O'Hara was gone, killed by a fragment from the last German round to hit the Hopkins. Above him, the sky had turned the colour of ash. Both ships burned, 2 silhouettes locked together in ruin. On the Steyr, Captain Gerlach watched his engines die. With her steering crippled and her holds afire, she was no longer seaworthy. He ordered scuttling charges set. At 10 a.m, the German raider was abandoned and sunk by her own crew. The Hopkins was dying too. Her hull listed, fires racing along her deck. Captain Buck gave his final command. "Abandon ship." Men staggered to the lifeboats through smoke and twisted steel. Some reached the rails, others never made it. The forward gun tub was a ruin. The bridge, a blackened skeleton. At 10:20 a.m, the Stephen Hopkins went under. The sea that had carried her now claimed her. 42 aboard were dead, among them Captain Buck, Lieutenant Willett, and nearly the entire engine room crew. The surviving 19 clung to a single lifeboat as debris drifted around them. Behind them, oil burned on the surface of the Atlantic. In the distance, the Steyr was gone. The only German surface raider ever sunk by a Liberty ship. The ocean fell quiet again. Only the wind and the faint sound of voices calling out across the waves. The sea swallowed the last of the Stephen Hopkins within minutes. The bow rose once, then slipped beneath the surface, taking with it 42 men. The survivors, 19 in all, clung to a single lifeboat. The air was heavy with the smell of oil and smoke. Around them drifted wreckage, a piece of mast, a scorched life ring, the shadow of their ship sliding into the deep. Captain Paul Buck, 40, the calm voice that had refused to surrender, was gone. Lieutenant Kenneth Willett, the gun officer who'd stayed at his post even after being hit, was gone. Radio officer Hudson Huey, who had managed to send one unfinished signal before the explosion took him, was gone. Chief Mate Richard Motzkowski from Michigan, Cook Albert L. Teest from San Francisco, Deck Cadet Arthur Chamberlain Jr., just 20 from Piedmont, California, gone. And with them, more than half the ship's company vanished beneath the waves. Out of 58 men aboard the Stephen Hopkins, only 19 reached the lifeboat. Those who survived looked back to see nothing but smoke and a stretch of burning sea. In the lifeboat were mariners, cadets, and a handful of Navy gunners, the remnants of the Hopkins crew. Among them, Second Engineer George S. Cronk, a steady man from the engine room, took command without hesitation. Their provisions were meagre: a few tins of biscuits, a small keg of water, no compass, and no charts. The radio was gone, and the sky was overcast. They drifted west, steering by stars when they appeared, and by instinct when they didn't. The first days were spent patching holes in the boat and nursing the wounded. Blisters formed on every hand from the oars. The salt air burned their throats. The ration of water was a swallow per man, twice a day. As the days stretched into weeks, one by one the weaker men slipped away. The log they kept marks the passing of 4, buried at sea with a short prayer whispered by Kronk. They spoke little. Most stared at the horizon, waiting for something to break it. A ship, a gull, even a cloud that looked like land. The nights were worse. The sea hissed against the hull and the stars seemed close enough to touch. Hunger twisted their stomachs. Thirst blurred their eyes. Yet somehow they kept rowing. On the 31st day, a sailor at the bow shouted, a thin cry that carried across the still water. Ahead of them, faint against the morning light, was the line of a shore. Brazil. The 15 who remained alive could barely stand when they touched land. Locals found them half delirious, their skin burned and lips cracked, but breathing. They had drifted more than 2,200 miles. In the quiet that followed, the names of the dead spread slowly through the merchant marine ranks. Their families learned what had happened, not from telegrams of victory, but from the words, "missing at sea." For their actions, the United States later recognized the Hopkins crew. Captain Paul Buck and Cadet Edwin Joseph O'Hara received the Merchant Marine Distinguished Service Medal. Lieutenant Kenneth Willett was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, and Second Engineer George S. Kronk was cited for his extraordinary seamanship in bringing the survivors to land. The world moved on. Other convoys sailed. Other ships went down. But the sea remembers. It remembers the smoke rising from 2 burning silhouettes on a grey morning, the echo of a single gun that refused to go silent, and the handful of men who would not surrender to fire, steel, or the endless Atlantic. The war would rage for 3 more years after the Stephen Hopkins went down. The Atlantic would claim thousands of ships and tens of thousands of lives. Yet from the wreck of that one Liberty ship rose a story that reached far beyond the ocean she vanished in. The Liberty ships were never built to be beautiful. President Roosevelt himself called them ugly ducklings. But in their blunt lines and welded seams lay the heartbeat of American industry. 2,710 cargo vessels built in less than 5 years, each one carrying supplies, hope, and risk across the sea. They were the lifeline of a world at war. From the shipyards of Richmond, Portland, Baltimore, and New Orleans, they sailed to every ocean, carrying everything from tanks and trucks to wheat and medicine. Each one represented the labor of thousands, the welders, riveters, and fitters who worked under floodlights through the night, their hands blistered but steady. Many of those hands belonged to women. Rosie the riveter and Wendy the welder became more than symbols. They were the backbone of the shipyards, learning in weeks what had once taken years to master. Others were men too old to fight, or too young, or deemed unfit for service. Together they built a fleet from raw steel and necessity. At Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards in Richmond, California, innovation turned shipbuilding into an assembly line. Prefabricated sections arrived by rail, were welded together in sequence, and rolled down the ways at a pace no one thought possible. The first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, had taken 244 days to build. Within a year, construction time dropped to just 33 days. The record, the SS Robert E. Peary, launched after only 4 days and 15 hours. For all their speed and simplicity, the Liberty ships proved stronger than anyone imagined. They endured torpedoes, storms, and years of hard use. Some were sunk on their maiden voyages. Others survived the entire war and went on to serve for decades. They were the unsung instruments of victory, plain, welded, and unstoppable. And among all of them, one name stood apart: Stephen Hopkins. She was the only Liberty ship ever known to sink an enemy's surface combatant. Her fight with the steer lasted less than half an hour, but it became a legend whispered across the convoys. Sailors spoke of her as proof that courage could weigh more than armor. In time, the medals became more than symbols of a single ship. They came to stand for every Liberty ship and every crew that crossed the ocean knowing what might wait beyond the horizon. Buck's command, Willett's courage, O'Hara's defiance, and Cronk's endurance became part of the Merchant Marine's living memory. Reminders that even the humblest freighter could carry the weight of heroism. At the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, the Athletics Center bears O'Hara's name. His photograph hangs in the hall beside the other fallen cadets, 142 in all, who gave their lives at sea. Of the 2,710 Liberty ships built, roughly 2,400 survived the war. Many were sold to private companies, sold for scrap, or renamed and sent back to sea in peacetime trade. A few endure still. SS Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco, SS John W. Brown in Baltimore, and SS Hellas Liberty in Greece, museum ships that carry the echo of a time when the world's freedom was measured in tons of steel. The Stephen Hopkins lies somewhere beneath the South Atlantic, a name etched into silence. No monument rises above her, no marble marks her resting place. But for those who understand what she carried and what she gave, her story endures. Because every Liberty ship was built to carry something precious across an ocean. The Hopkins carried courage itself,